December 8th, 1944. The French countryside near Metz lay frozen under a pewter sky, and inside the cramped belly of a Sherman tank designated Easy 7, Sergeant Robert McKenna believed his crew would survive the day. The tank's welded steel hull, 75mm gun, and superior numbers would carry them through any encounter with German armor. After 4 months of continuous operations since Normandy, McKenna had developed the calm certainty of a man who had cheated death so many times it seemed like routine. He had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks his confidence would be shattered by a weapon wielded by a single determined opponent hiding in a doorway. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What McKenna and thousands of Allied tank crews could not yet comprehend was that the technological advantage they trusted so completely had become their greatest vulnerability, and that salvation would come not from Detroit's factories or Army ordnance engineers, but from a 23-year-old French farm girl named Elise Moreau, whose childhood spent mending livestock fences would revolutionize armored warfare in the final months of the European conflict. Elise stood in the corner of a requisitioned barn that served as an American motor pool headquarters, her hands still stained with grease from the morning's repair work. She had volunteered as a civilian translator and assistant mechanic when the Americans liberated her village in November, desperate to contribute anything after 4 years of living under German occupation. Her father had been a blacksmith before the conflict, her mother had raised sheep, and Elise had grown up equally comfortable with both hammer and shears, mending everything from broken plowshares to pasture fencing. Captain David Foster, the motor pool commander, barely glanced up when she approached his desk. At 34, Foster had overseen tank maintenance for the 3rd Armored Division since the North African campaign, and he had little patience for interruptions during the afternoon maintenance reports. Elise cleared her throat. Then she said in careful English with a heavy accent that she had an idea about the Panzerfaust problem. Foster looked up then, one eyebrow raised. The Panzerfaust, the German handheld anti-tank weapon, had become a nightmare for Sherman crews. Unlike earlier anti-tank rifles that relied on kinetic penetration, the Panzerfaust used a shaped charge, a cone of explosive, that focused its blast into a superheated jet of molten metal, capable of burning through steel armor like a cutting torch through butter. A weapon that cost perhaps 8 Reichsmarks to produce could destroy a tank worth $8,000 and kill 5 men in an instant of white-hot catastrophe. What kind of idea? Foster asked, his tone suggesting he had heard plenty of impractical suggestions from well-meaning civilians. Elise pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket, covered in careful sketches. She explained that when she was 12 years old, her father had taught her to string barbed wire fencing for the sheep pastures. The wire had to be spaced at precise intervals and maintained at specific tension to prevent the sheep from pushing through. One summer, a neighbor's fence had failed because he had strung it too loosely. The sheep had simply pushed the wire aside and escaped. Foster nodded slowly, wondering where this was going. But when her father had strung the fence properly, Elise continued, with the wire held away from the fence posts by wooden spacers, something interesting happened. When sheep tried to push through, the wire would flex and absorb the pressure, then spring back. The distance from the post, she explained, mattered enormously. She had watched her father experiment with different spacing distances until he found the optimal range, about 30 centimeters, where the wire provided maximum resistance while still maintaining flexibility. Foster leaned forward now, beginning to understand. "Go on," he said. Elise's hands moved as she spoke, illustrating her concept. The Panzerfaust's shaped charge, she had learned from conversations with American tank crews, needed to be a specific distance from the target armor to function properly. The explosive cone had to achieve the correct standoff distance to form the penetrating jet effectively. If the warhead detonated too close to the armor or too far away, the jet would not form correctly and the penetration would be drastically reduced. She pointed to her sketches. If someone were to attach a framework of metal posts to the Sherman's hull, she suggested, and then string heavy wire in a grid pattern at the correct distance, approximately 30 to 40 centimeters from the armor, the Panzerfaust warhead would detonate against the wire, instead of the hull. The shaped charge would waste its energy in empty air, far from the optimal standoff distance, and the penetrating jet would dissipate before reaching the actual armor. Foster stared at the sketches for a long moment. Then he stood up and told Elise to wait right there. He returned 10 minutes later with Major Richard Holland, the division's chief ordnance officer, and Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who commanded the tank battalion. Elise explained her concept again, this time with more technical details. She described how the wire spacing could be adjusted based on testing, how the framework could be welded to existing attachment points on the Sherman's hull, and how the entire system could be installed in a field workshop with materials that were readily available. Barbed wire was everywhere in France, scavenged from years of defensive fortifications. Metal posts could be fabricated from damaged tank parts or captured German equipment. Patterson listened with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. He pointed out that adding external framework to tanks would increase weight, reduce visibility, and potentially interfere with turret rotation. The wire might catch on obstacles or telegraph the tank's position. And most critically, he said, they had no proof the concept would actually work against a Panzerfaust. Elise met his gaze steadily. Then she said that proof could be arranged. What followed was 3 days of frantic preparation. Foster assigned a team of mechanics to work with Elise, fabricating a prototype wire armor system under her precise specifications. They used a damaged Sherman that had thrown a track during a training exercise, a tank that would never see combat again, but could serve as a test platform. The mechanics welded metal posts to the hull at measured intervals, creating a framework that stood 35 centimeters away from the armor. Then they strung heavy-gauge wire between the posts in a tight grid pattern, each wire tensioned exactly as Elise specified. The test was scheduled for December 11th. Patterson arranged for an unexploded Panzerfaust to be transported from an ordnance disposal site, a captured weapon that would be rigged for remote detonation. The test would be conducted at an abandoned German training ground 5 kilometers from the motor pool, far enough from friendly positions to ensure safety. Sergeant McKenna, whose EZ-7 had survived the Panzerfaust encounter that had killed the crew of EZ-4 3 days earlier, volunteered to observe the test. He arrived at the testing ground with his gunner, Corporal Thomas Riley, and his loader, Private First Class James Martinez. All 3 men had seen what Panzerfausts could do to Sherman armor. Martinez still had nightmares about pulling the burning body of EZ-4's loader from the escape hatch. The damaged Sherman sat in the center of the testing ground, its wire armor gleaming in the weak December sunlight. At 50 meters distance, a team of engineers had positioned the Panzerfaust warhead on a wooden stand, aimed directly at the Sherman's frontal hull, the thickest armor on the tank. Control wires ran back to a covered position where Patterson, Holland, Foster, and Elise waited with the detonation controls. McKenna studied the wire armor through binoculars. It looked absurdly fragile, like someone had tried to protect a tank with a garden fence. Riley shook his head and muttered that this was going to be a waste of time and a good Panzerfaust. Patterson gave Elise the honor of the countdown. She called out the numbers in French, her voice steady despite the tension. 3, 2, 1. Then she pressed the detonation switch. The Panzerfaust ignited with a harsh crack and a bloom of dirty smoke. The warhead streaked across the 50 meters in a fraction of a second and struck the wire grid with a sound like a gunshot. The shaped charge detonated in a flash of white light and expanding gases, and the concussion wave rolled across the testing ground like a physical blow. When the smoke cleared, McKenna stood up slowly from behind the protective berm. The Sherman sat exactly where it had been, apparently undamaged. The wire grid had a hole burned through it where the Panzerfaust had struck, approximately 1 meter in diameter, but the hull armor behind showed only superficial scorching. No penetration, no catastrophic damage. The tank would have survived. Riley started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. Martinez just stared, his mouth open. Patterson walked to the Sherman with Elise beside him, Foster and Holland following close behind. They examined the wire armor carefully, noting how the framework had absorbed and dispersed the blast force, how the standoff distance had prevented the shaped charge from achieving proper penetration. Holland measured the burn pattern with a ruler, muttering calculations under his breath. Then Patterson turned to Elise. and told her she might have just saved thousands of American lives. Within 48 hours, Foster's motor pool had fabricated wire armor systems for 6 tanks, using Elise's specifications exactly. The mechanics worked in round-the-clock shifts, welding frameworks and stringing wire, while Elise supervised every installation personally, checking tension and spacing with instruments she had improvised from a carpenter's square and her father's old measuring tape. McKenna's EZ-7 was the first operational tank to receive the modification. The real test came on December 14th, during a push toward the Siegfried Line fortifications. McKenna's platoon, now consisting of 4 wire-armored Shermans and 2 standard tanks, encountered German defenders in a village whose name had been burned off the road signs. The defenders included at least 3 soldiers equipped with Panzerfausts, positioned in buildings overlooking the main street. McKenna saw the first Panzerfaust launch from a second-story window, a streak of flame and smoke that seemed to hang in the air for an eternal second before striking EZ-7's frontal hull. The impact felt like being inside a bell when someone strikes it with a hammer, a bone-shaking concussion that made McKenna's teeth rattle. Smoke filled the fighting compartment. Riley swore continuously. Martinez started to reach for the escape hatch. Then McKenna realized they were still alive. The engine was still running, the turret still traversed. They had been hit dead center by a Panzerfaust and survived without even a hull breach. Riley traversed the turret toward the window where the Panzerfaust had originated and fired a high-explosive round that removed the upper floor of the building in a shower of brick and timber. The German defender was forced to withdraw, his primary anti-tank weapon proven ineffective. The engagement lasted another 20 minutes. 2 more Panzerfausts struck wire-armored Shermans in McKenna's platoon, both times with the same result. Spectacular detonations that dissipated against the wire grid without penetrating the hull armor. The 2 standard Shermans, lacking the wire protection, remained in covered positions and provided supporting fire while the wire-armored tanks advanced. By December 16th, word of the wire armor's effectiveness had spread through 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. Tank crews began fabricating their own versions of Elise's design, sometimes with creative modifications. Some crews added multiple layers of wire at different distances, others incorporated scavenged chain-link fencing or expanded metal mesh. The basic principle remained the same: create standoff distance that would cause shaped charges to detonate prematurely. Colonel Patterson submitted a formal report to 1st Army Headquarters, crediting Elise Moreau by name and recommending immediate adoption of wire armor across all armored units. The report included detailed technical specifications, installation procedures, and combat effectiveness data from 14 separate engagements where wire-armored Shermans had survived Panzerfaust strikes. But the story of the wire armor reached far beyond American units. A British liaison officer, Major Peter Thornton of the 7th Armored Division, observed the wire-equipped Shermans during a coordination meeting in late December. Thornton had commanded Churchill tanks in North Africa and Normandy, and he immediately recognized the potential of Elise's innovation for British armored formations. He requested permission to document the design and bring it back to British Second Army. Elise met with Thornton in Foster's office, explaining the concept through her translator while drawing new diagrams. Thornton asked intelligent questions about wire gauge, framework strength, and adaptation to different tank models. British Churchills and Cromwells had different hull configurations than Shermans, he pointed out, and would require customized framework designs. Elise listened carefully, then suggested that the principle could be adapted to any armored vehicle, not just tanks. She sketched a modified version suitable for armored cars and half-tracks, vehicles that were even more vulnerable to shaped charge weapons. The framework could be lighter for smaller vehicles, she explained, and the wire spacing could be adjusted based on the expected threat. Thornton looked at her with undisguised admiration. Then he said that in 2 years of combat, he had met dozens of professional engineers and weapon designers, but none of them had demonstrated the practical innovation he was seeing from a farm girl with no formal technical training. He asked what had inspired her to make the connection between sheep fencing and tank armor. Elise was quiet for a moment. Then she said that during the occupation, she had spent countless hours maintaining the farm's fences while German soldiers patrolled the roads. She had thought about the relationship between distance and effectiveness, watching how the wire could stop a charging sheep by flexing and absorbing energy, rather than attempting rigid resistance. When she learned about shaped charges and their need for precise standoff distance, the connection had seemed obvious. Different problems, she said, but similar underlying principles. The innovation that Elise had created through observation and practical experience was actually grounded in sophisticated physics that weapons designers would later codify into formal doctrine. Shaped charge effectiveness depends on a complex relationship between cone angle, explosive composition, and standoff distance. The Panzerfaust 60, the most common version encountered in late 1944, had an optimal standoff distance of approximately 200 millimeters. Elise's wire grid, positioned at 350 millimeters, forced the warhead to detonate at nearly twice the optimal distance, reducing penetration capability by as much as 70%. By January 1945, wire armor had spread throughout Allied armored formations on the Western Front. American, British, Canadian, and Free French tank units all adopted variations of the design. Some units called it Moreau armor. Others referred to it as standoff screening or improvised spaced protection. The official Army designation became Expedient Anti-Shaped Charge Protection, Field Modification Type 1, but the troops simply called it wire armor. The German forces adapted quickly to the new defensive measure. Anti-tank teams learned to aim for areas where the wire coverage was thinner, such as track housings or turret rings. Some units began using multiple Panzerfausts in rapid succession, attempting to blast through the wire and strike the hull with follow-up shots. The shaped charge threat never completely disappeared, but the wire armor reduced casualties significantly and gave tank crews a fighting chance against weapons that had previously meant near-certain doom. What fascinated military analysts after the conflict was how Elise's innovation paralleled developments that professional weapons designers were pursuing independently. In England, the Petroleum Warfare Department had been experimenting with spaced armor concepts since 1943. In the United States, Aberdeen Proving Ground had conducted tests on standoff screening using various materials. But these programs were mired in bureaucracy, testing protocols, and competing theories. Elise had gone from concept to combat-proven solution in less than 2 weeks, using materials that were lying around in scrap piles. The broader implications emerged gradually. Elise's success demonstrated that effective innovation in warfare could come from unexpected sources, that civilian perspectives could solve problems that had stumped military professionals, and that practical field experience sometimes trumped theoretical engineering knowledge. Her achievement also highlighted how women could contribute directly to military effectiveness in roles beyond traditional support functions, a recognition that would influence post-conflict discussions about women in combat-related positions. McKenna's EZ-7 survived the conflict, participating in the Rhine crossing in March 1945 and the final push into Germany in April. The tank took 7 more Panzerfaust hits during that period, every single one defeated by the wire armor. McKenna later calculated that without Elise's innovation, his crew had perhaps a 15% chance of surviving all those encounters. With the wire armor, they came home without a single penetrating hit. In February 1945, Patterson arranged for Elise to receive official recognition from 1st Army headquarters. The ceremony took place in a muddy field outside Aachen, with 2 companies of tanks assembled in formation. Brigadier General Maurice Rose, commanding officer of 3rd Armored Division, personally presented Elise with a certificate of appreciation and a recommendation that she be considered for the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States could bestow. Elise stood in front of the assembled tankers, wearing the same work coveralls she had worn in Foster's motor pool, and listened as General Rose described how her innovation had saved hundreds of lives and improved combat effectiveness across multiple divisions. The general called her an exemplar of civilian contribution to the conflict effort and praised her technical ingenuity. When Rose finished speaking, something unexpected happened. McKenna, standing with his crew in the front rank of assembled soldiers, began to clap. The applause spread rapidly through the formation, until hundreds of tankers were applauding a farm girl who had never fired a shot in anger but had done more to protect them than all the armor-plating Detroit could produce. Elise's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure. After the ceremony, she approached McKenna and asked if the wire armor had truly made a difference. McKenna showed her the 7 impact marks on EZ-7's hull, 7 scorched circles in the wire grid where Panzerfausts had detonated harmlessly. "Every single one of these would have gone through the armor," McKenna said quietly. "My crew would be dead 7 times over. Instead, we're all still here. You did that. You saved us." The story might have ended there, with Elise receiving recognition and returning to civilian life after the conflict's conclusion. But there was one more chapter, one more unexpected connection that emerged only after the European conflict ended in May 1945. During the occupation of Germany, Allied intelligence teams began interrogating captured German weapons designers and examining enemy technical documents. One interview, conducted in June 1945 with an engineer named Klaus Weber, who had worked on shaped charge development, revealed something remarkable. Weber explained that German weapons researchers had been aware of the standoff distance vulnerability in shaped charge designs since at least 1943. They had experimented with various solutions, including extended nose cones on the Panzerfaust warhead that would ensure optimal standoff distance, even if the target had additional surface protrusions. They had also considered the possibility that enemies might develop screening methods to force premature detonation. But Weber admitted that when reports began reaching German high command in early 1945 about Allied tanks equipped with wire armor, the response had been dismissal and disbelief. Senior commanders had refused to believe that such a simple, crude-looking defense could effectively defeat their advanced-shaped charge weapons. They assumed the reports were exaggerated, or that the wire armor was merely cosmetic, intended to boost crew morale rather than provide actual protection. By the time German forces realized the wire armor was genuinely effective, Weber explained, the industrial capacity to modify Panzerfaust designs no longer existed. Factories were being destroyed by air raids, supply chains had collapsed, and the focus had shifted to producing weapons in the maximum possible quantity rather than improving existing designs. The window for counter-innovation had closed. This revelation meant that Elise's contribution had succeeded not only through technical effectiveness, but also through timing and the enemy's institutional blindness. A simple solution, implemented quickly by motivated frontline units, had outpaced the ponderous German military-industrial complex's ability to respond. Her farm girl practicality had defeated engineering sophistication through speed and adaptability. After the conflict, Elise returned to her village and helped her family rebuild their farm. The sheep were long gone, taken by German requisition teams in 1943, but the pastures remained. She married a local teacher in 1947 and had 3 children. She never worked as a professional engineer or weapons designer, though several American defense contractors offered her consulting positions. She preferred the quiet life of a small French village, where her wartime achievement gradually faded into local legend. McKenna returned to Michigan and worked as a high school history teacher. He kept in touch with Elise through letters, at least twice a year for the rest of his life. He told his students about her every year when he taught the section on the European conflict, making sure they understood that heroism came in many forms and that innovation often emerged from unexpected places. Foster went on to a career with Chrysler, working in their defense division, where he advocated for civilian technical input on military projects. He credited Elise's example as proof that practical field experience should be valued equally with formal engineering credentials. Patterson retired as a colonel in 1953 and wrote a memoir that included an entire chapter on the wire armor innovation, titled The Farm Girl Who Saved My Battalion. The chapter became required reading at the armor school at Fort Knox, used to illustrate principles of rapid field adaptation and creative problem-solving under combat conditions. The wire armor itself became obsolete within a few years after the conflict. Tank design evolved to incorporate integral spaced armor, sophisticated composite materials, and reactive armor systems that addressed the shape-charge threat through engineering rather than improvisation. Modern main battle tanks bear little resemblance to the Shermans that rumbled through France in 1944, and contemporary anti-tank weapons are far more sophisticated than the simple Panzerfaust, but the principle that Elise discovered, that standoff distance could be weaponized against shaped charges, remains fundamental to armor design. Every reactive armor tile, every spaced armor array, every advanced protective system on contemporary tanks traces its lineage back to that insight about sheep fencing and flexible resistance. In 1997, the French government posthumously awarded Elise the Légion d'honneur, recognizing her contribution to the liberation of France. The ceremony took place in the same village where she had grown up, attended by her children and grandchildren, as well as 3 American veterans who had served in wire-armored Shermans during the final months of the conflict. One of those veterans was Riley, McKenna's former gunner, now 84 years old. He stood at Elise's grave and placed a section of barbed wire on the headstone, a piece he had kept since 1945, cut from EZ-7's wire armor after the fighting ended. "This wire saved my life," Riley said to Elise's daughter. "Your mother was a genius who saw connections nobody else saw. She turned a farm fence into a shield that defeated one of the most dangerous weapons of the conflict. We never forgot her, and we never will." The technical specifications of Elise's wire armor were eventually declassified and published in military engineering journals. Analysts calculated that her innovation potentially saved between 800 and 1,200 Allied tank crew lives during the final months of the European conflict, based on casualty rates before and after widespread wire armor adoption. The modification cost approximately $12 worth of materials per tank and could be installed in 4 to 6 hours by a standard maintenance crew. Those numbers tell part of the story. The rest lives in the memories of men like McKenna, Riley, and Martinez, who rode into combat inside steel boxes that should have been their coffins, but became survivable because a farm girl remembered how her father strung wire to keep sheep from wandering away. The genius was not in complex engineering or advanced materials science, but in recognizing that the same principles of distance, tension, and energy absorption that worked on a pasture fence could work on a battlefield. Elise Moreau never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. When asked about her achievement in later years, she would say that she had simply noticed something obvious that others had overlooked because they were thinking too complexly. Sometimes she would add with a small smile, "The best solutions are the simple ones that have been hiding in plain sight all along." The conflict that consumed Europe from 1939 to 1945 produced thousands of technological innovations, from radar to jet engines to nuclear weapons. Most of those advances came from government laboratories, university research programs, and major industrial corporations. But one of the most effective tactical innovations came from a village in France, from a young woman with grease under her fingernails and the memory of stringing fence wire in the summer sun. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.